Good morning. I'm Moussalli. I'm head of Clyde & Co.'s Marine Asset and Projects team. So we cover all aspects of transactional, non-contentious shipping. I'm very excited to be here today, and thank you, Lee, for inviting me. I'm briefly going to look at some of the EU regulations impacting the maritime industry in context. So we'll look at the Fit for 55 objectives, consider the MRV regulations, which interlink with the EU ETS and the Fuel EU maritime regulations. I'll give you an overview of the timeline of how the regulations are intended to work together, and we'll look at some of the potential legal issues. So the context of the maritime EU regulations. As we all know, the EU committed to reduce its net greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030, compared with 1990 levels. The Fit for 55 package of legislation was adopted in September 2020, and it's designed to provide a framework for all sectors of the EU economy fit to meet the target. The EU claims that this sets it on a path to reach its climate targets in, and I quote, a fair, cost-effective and competitive way. To achieve climate neutrality, a 90% reduction in transport emissions is needed by 2050. All transport modes, including maritime transport, will need to contribute to these reductive targets. With specific regard to the maritime sector, the new regulations of note included in the package are the extension of the EU emissions trading system, the ETS, to the maritime transport industry, which is effective from 1st of January 2024, and the Fuel EU maritime regulation, adopted in July 2023, applicable from 1st of January 2025, with the exception of Article 6, which covers the principles for monitoring and reporting. So, looking at the MRV regulation, as we all know, it came into force several years ago, and it was amended recently to adapt for the application of the EU ETS to the maritime transport industry. I'm only going to highlight the changes that the amendment regulation has introduced. It applies to EEA-related voyages to ships of 5,000 gross tonnes and above, transporting cargo and passengers for commercial purposes. From 1st of January 2024, companies must not only monitor carbon dioxide, but also methane and nitrous oxide, and the emissions from those gases are to be included in the monitoring plan. The plans are submitted to accredited verifiers through Thetis MRV, which is the platform also used for the EU ETS monitoring obligations, and it's the intention that that platform will be used for Fuel EU Maritime as well. For ships falling within the scope of the MRV regulation for the first time after 1st of January 2024, companies are to submit a monitoring plan to the administering authority without undue delay and no later than 3 months after each ship's first call in a port under the jurisdiction of a member state. From 1st of January 2025, the EU MRV regulation will also apply to offshore ships and general cargo ships from 400 gross tonnes and above. The reporting period runs from 1st of January to 31 December of any given year. By 31st of March 2025, companies should submit to the administrating authority of the shipping company, to the authorities of the flag state and to the European Commission, a verified emissions report for the reporting period of 2024 for each ship under their responsibility. For ships caught by the EU ETS regulation, they must submit the aggregated emissions data at company level that cover the emissions in the reporting period for 2024. The EU ETS. What is it and what is it seeking to do? So the EU ETS is the world's largest carbon market, originally introduced by the EU in 2005 to combat climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions through an emissions cap and trade system. This means that a limit is put on how many greenhouse gas emissions are permitted to be released into the atmosphere from industries. Companies falling under the scope of the EU ETS are able to trade emission rights, and they must surrender purchased allowances equivalent to their emissions each year. This was expanded with effect from 1st January 2024 to apply to the maritime transport industry, which was a huge shift. In order to comply with the EU ETS, we need a functional MRV system in place. So initially, the EU ETS will only cover the monitoring and reporting of carbon dioxide emissions on a tank-to-wake basis. From 2026, it will also cover methane and nitrous oxide, and a review of the system in 2026 will consider whether the EU ETS should include emissions on a well-to-wake basis. It follows the polluter pays principle. It states that member states must ensure that if another entity other than the shipping company under a contract takes over buying fuel or running the ship, the shipping company can be reimbursed for the costs of giving up allowances. So a phrase that I've heard used quite a bit recently for that, if in doubt, follow the fuel. It's not yet clear how this will be enforced by member states, and it's highly advised to include express provisions in charter parties or other contracts of employment to clearly allocate the liability for the cost and the provision of allowances. So it applies to all commercial vessels of 5,000 gross tonnes or more that call at EU ports, regardless of flag or of the owner's jurisdiction of incorporation. It does not currently include offshore ships, but it will be expanded with effect from 1st of January 2027 to include offshore ships. A feasibility report will be carried out by the end of 2026 as to whether the smaller vessels below 5,000 gross tonnes should be included in the EU ETS. The report will consider the feasibility, economic, environmental and social impacts of expanding the EU ETS to the smaller ships. At the moment, the thought being that it will be administratively burdensome to include those ships. There are some exemptions to the EU ETS, some of which we've noted here, military government ships, primitive bill and fishing vessels, but they probably aren't relevant to you here today. Here we've shown a gradual phase-in approach that the EU ETS is taking and how this works with the MRV. In grey, you can see the elements which are only under the MRV scope. The blue shows the elements covered by both the MRV scope and the EU ETS scope. The reporting period for both runs from 1st of January to 31st of December of any given year. And each shipping company must submit a verified company emissions report to the administrating authority by 31st of March the following year. And allowances would be submitted by 30th of September of the year following the reporting period. So looking at the gradual phase-in of the emissions. So in September 2025, 40% of 2024 emissions will need to be compensated. In September 2026, 70% of 2025 emissions will need to be compensated with allowances. In September 2027, 100% of 2026 emissions will need to be compensated. And don't forget that from 2027, offshore ships of 5,000 gross tonnes and above are included. So in September 2028, offshore ships will need to surrender allowances for 100% of emissions of CO2, nitrous oxide, and the methane. What are the penalties for non-compliance? So shipping companies that fail to surrender their allowances when due will incur an excess emissions penalty of about €100, which will be corrected for inflation, per tonne of CO2 equivalent emitted that has not been surrendered. The payment of the penalty will not negate the surrender obligation, meaning that the missing emission allowances must still be surrendered by the shipping company in the following reporting period. If a shipping company fails to comply with the EU allowance surrender requirements for 2 or more consecutive reporting periods, and where other enforcement measures have failed, the competent authority of the member state of the port of entry may issue an expulsion order such that all other member states except the flag state shall refuse entry to all ships operating under that shipping company's control, and where a ship is flagged in a member state and it enters one of its ports, the flag state may detain the ship once the shipping company has had an opportunity to fulfill its obligations and has failed to do so. The expulsion order will remain until the shipping company does fulfill its emission allowance surrender obligations. There's a further deterrent for non-compliance. The names of the shipping companies which are non-compliant will be published. This will expose their failure to meet emissions obligations and will obviously lead to reputational damage. The company-wide application of the EU ETS will have significant consequences. Theoretically, non-compliance by a technical manager is an area of concern, where many owners are delegating the responsibility of compliance to the technical managers. It could have adverse consequences for the ships of an unrelated owner. It's likely that parties may seek to deal with the risk contractually, for example, by making the issuance of an expulsion order or the failure to timeously surrender EUAs, a termination event in the management agreement, but at that point, it may have gone too far already. So who's responsible for compliance? It's the shipping company. But who is the shipping company? Luckily, the EU issued some further guidance of this after the initial publication, which had caused some confusion. So the definition means that the shipping company can be the registered owner or the ISM company of the ship. They need to decide amongst themselves who is best placed to take on the responsibilities for compliance. And in all instances, we're seeing the obligation being delegated to technical managers. There needs to be an explicit agreement to reflect this. Otherwise, the default position is that the registered owner is responsible. The owner must mandate the shipping company, and the mandate must be submitted to the administering authority and the verifier. So here's just a slide where we've set out the steps for compliance. Each company needs to be registered with the administering authority, and the EU will prepare a list of those authorities per company, and that will be updated every 2 years. The list is available online. By 31st of March each year, a verified company emission report needs to be submitted to the authority. The company emission report aggregates the emissions within the scope of the EU ETS reported and verified for each ship under the responsibility of the shipping company during the reporting period. And by 30th of September each year, the emission allowances need to be surrendered to that authority. Moving on to the Fuel EU Maritime Regulation. So it's part of the basket of measures put forward under the Fit for 55 package that we looked at the beginning. It seeks to propose a common EU regulatory framework to increase the share of renewable and low-carbon fuels used in the fuel mix. Further, it recognises that to do so, and again I quote, clear and uniform obligations are needed on the ship's use of renewable low-carbon fuels to try to maintain a level playing field and to maintain competitiveness. The thought being that with increased predictability in the fuel demands, the expectation it would stimulate technology development and fuel production to help the sector unlock the chicken and egg situation between demand and supply of renewable and low-carbon fuels. Currently, neither at the IMO level or the EU level is there any mechanism that takes into account the indirect costs of emissions that are not accounted for, such as the social cost in terms of climate change and air pollution that I'm sure we can all agree is critical. Therefore, the regulation provides that the greenhouse gas performance is to be assessed on a well-to-wake basis, so it takes into account the impacts of energy production, transport and fuel distribution, and the use on board the vessel. The detailed methodology for the calculation is set out in Annex 2 to the regulations. As per the EU ETS, you need to have a robust MRV regulation in place to trace compliance with the provisions of the regulation. It is a highly technical proposal, and the EU recognises that it will require regular amendments to reflect legal and technical developments, and those will be carried out through implementing measures, possibly at a member state level. So the applicability of the Fuel EU Maritime. As with the EU ETS, it applies to passenger and cargo ships of more than 5,000 gross tonnes, regardless of flag and jurisdiction of owner. There are similar exemptions to the EU ETS. The greenhouse gas intensity is a measure of the carbon dioxide equivalent emissions per quantum of energy used on board. It's measured based on fuel consumption monitored under the EU MRV and the emission factors of the fuels used on the well-to-wake basis. Note that all passenger ships and container ships will be required to use onshore power supplies at major ports from 2030 and at all EU ports from 2035. The methodology for calculating the greenhouse gas emission factors can be calculated in several different ways. Certain fuel types, biogas, biofuels, and renewable fuels of non-biological origin, will be calculated as per the methodologies in the Renewable Energy Directive, RED II. As you can see, the energy used within the scope of the Fuel EU Maritime is similar to the scope of the emissions covered under the EU ETS. So it's 100% of energy used to or from ports of a member state, 50% used from or to a non-EU port or from or to a port of a member state, and 50% used at berth in the port of a member state. So the regulation is goal-based. It imposes decreasing limits of life cycle greenhouse gas intensity of fuels used on board ships, measured on the reported fuel consumption and the emission factors of the fuels used. As you can see, the reduction starts at 2% in 2025, and by 2050, the reduction should be 80%. It leaves the choice of technology to the market. Again, there are financial penalties for non-compliance. If on 1st of May, the year following the reporting period, the ship has a compliance deficit, the company will pay a penalty. And the company will pay a penalty for each non-compliant port call. Similar to the EU ETS, the penalties will be enforced by the member states. So if ships fail to present a valid Fuel EU compliance certificate for 2 or more consecutive reporting periods, where other enforcement measures have failed, the member state of the port may issue an expulsion order. Every member state, with the exception of the flag state again, shall refuse entry to that ship. The member state flag state can order a flag detention until the company fulfills its obligations. Once the obligations are fulfilled, the ship will be issued with a Fuel EU compliance certificate, which must remain on board and is valid for 18 months from issuance. Interestingly, it offers the regulation in order to encourage demand is looking at green bonuses, borrowing, banking and pooling. So in order to encourage demand for the renewable fuels of non-biological origins, the ships can be rewarded by allowing the energy from them to be counted twice for the calculation of the ship's annual greenhouse gas intensity. The banking works that the compliance surplus on the greenhouse gas intensity calculated for a reporting period can be banked for the following reporting period for the next same ship. And in the case of a compliance deficit, the company can borrow an advanced compliance surplus from the following reporting period of the ship. These can only be done if certain requirements are met. The pooling works that compliance of 2 or more ships can be pooled to balance the fuel greenhouse gas intensity targets of the ships involved. The ships can be controlled by more than one company, but they must have the same verifier. The compliance balance for one ship can only be used in one pool for each reporting period. By 30th of March of the year following the reporting period, the company shall notify the verifier of the intended pool, and by 30th of April of that year, the composition of the pool is recorded and it cannot subsequently change. The company decides how to allocate the compliance balance of the pool to each ship. So here we've set out just a very brief summary of the steps of compliance for the Fuel EU Maritime. I've touched upon, I think, all of these by now. So I'm not going to go through this in detail. Now here we've put together a condensed timeline of how the 3 different regulations, the MRV, the ETS and the Fuel EU, are expected to work together. We will have a comprehensive version available in the next couple of weeks. And we've highlighted where the regulations align in order to identify how they're intended to work together. As you can see, at least the reporting periods align, being 1st of January to the end of December for each year. Oops. Do that. And you can see how the MRV and the EU ETS is intended to work together. And then you can see how the offshore ships are brought into the different regulations as well. So potential legal issues from all of these regulations. What are we expecting to see? In respect of the EU ETS, make sure charter parties or other contracts of employment that you're negotiating now address the EU ETS. If they'll extend beyond this year, they should also address the Fuel EU Maritime Regulation. In our view, it's not a good idea to seek reimbursement of allowances or money for the ETS. The allowances should be transferred or money paid on a regular basis. For example, throughout the year on a voyage-by-voyage basis or quarterly, which means a reconciliation mechanism needs to be built in as well. To do this, it requires early agreement on the data and verification of the data, and the shipping company needs to be transparent. If data is shared and verified regularly, it should minimise the scope for any disputed calculations, where you might have periods of off-hire, detention, deviation. We've seen owners and charterers starting with one of the BIMCO ETS clauses, and we've negotiated those on a case-by-case basis for our clients. If the calculations are done regularly, it should also mitigate the large administrative burden the shipping company is likely to encounter immediately prior to the 30th of September of each year. With respect for the Fuel EU, it's early days to identify potential legal issues. An area we expect to be complex, which is already being talked about, is the shipbuilding contracts and how changes are managed between builder, buyer and suppliers as technology develops. Any changes will probably need to be addressed through change orders, which will need to cover the impact on timing of delivery and obviously the cost. There may be warranty implications with introducing new technology. How long will the warranty last, given builders seek to have an incentive to restrict the warranty period? There are questions around the scope of the warranty, including whether the builder, for example, would be responsible for issues with the construction of an ammonia engine provided by a subcontractor. Supply chain resilience and lack of bunkering infrastructure is likely to be a big issue, and the impact on charter parties may mean that there are strict requirements for fuels to be provided and consumed. This is why we're seeing a focus on the development of green corridors where bunkering infrastructure is already in place. It might be sensible for charter parties to provide that where the vessel can only use one type of alternative fuel with limited availability, narrower trading limits are imposed whilst the infrastructure develops. Off-spec fuel issues and questions around how green alternative fuels are actually in practice will also need to be addressed. Safety and crew training, bankability, so financing requirements, covenants are likely to change. And as Philip touched upon, there's a lack of a unified global framework, which means there may well be conflicts between IMO, EU and national regulations. Throughout all of these issues, it's key that the allocation of responsibility and liability for compliance cost is clear in any contracts. So just quickly how Clyde & Co can perhaps help you on your sustainability journey. We've got several solutions. I put some of them up here. I think one of note is our net zero legal audit, which is a comprehensive audit of your standard contracts, which can identify areas of climate change risks and hotspots. And we can also do the same exercise for your supply chain. We also have a climate change consultancy, and there is a quarterly climate change publication for a cost. And finally, our decarbonisation hub, which is on our website. It's a live page where we have specific maritime decarbonisation information available. And I hope to have the timeline that I showed you earlier up on that website, as I said, in a couple of weeks. And we will have new content. And we also run a podcast about decarbonisation in shipping. And the last series we did was about the EU ETS. And we're planning a series on alternative fuels. Thank you very much.